My name is Nina Roberts. I'm 32, and if there's one thing I learned growing up, it's this. In my family, I was never the chosen one. My older sister was treated like some flawless treasure. Rent paid, debts cleared, even a whole house handed to her, as if life came with a personal cheat code. Meanwhile, every accomplishment of mine was brushed aside like it barely existed. For years, I stayed quiet. I worked. I struggled. I built everything on my own without expecting a single ounce of support. And still, nothing I did ever matched the way my parents worshipped her. They defended her, funded her, rescued her from every mess she created. I was just the daughter who would be fine somehow, but last Christmas proved something I never wanted to believe. They didn't just favor her. They expected me to sacrifice everything for her. At that dinner, all it took was one comment, one harmless question thrown across the table, and suddenly the whole family froze. My sister stared at me like she had just discovered a lifelong betrayal. My mother's face twisted as if I'd committed some unforgivable sin. And when the truth slipped out, when they realized what I had built behind the scenes, everything exploded. My sister dropped to the floor wailing, demanding I give her $15 million on the spot. My mother started screaming at me in front of everyone, insisting I owed my sister a fair share of my success, as if my life's work somehow belonged to them. If you want to know how a single sentence turned a quiet family dinner into the moment I finally cut ties forever, stay with me until the end. This one gets unbelievable. Before I continue, make sure to subscribe and hit the like button so you don't miss any of my story times. There was a point, long before adulthood ever arrived, when I started to realize something about the structure of our home. It wasn't announced, explained, or openly defended, yet it lived in everything we did. My sister, Kelsey Roberts, existed at the center of a world I was only allowed to orbit. And somehow, everyone seemed perfectly comfortable with that arrangement. My parents, Peter and Diane Roberts, never said they had a favorite. They didn't need to. The way decisions fell into place did it for them. Kelsey's wants weren't treated like wishes. They were treated like obligations the household naturally rearranged itself to meet. If she needed new uniforms for cheer practice, they appeared. If she wanted to switch teams because she felt bored, my mom made calls until she found a better option. If she decided a school project was too overwhelming, my dad stepped in and practically completed it for her. Meanwhile, I learned early that anything I needed had to be justified, and anything I wanted had to be earned. I wasn't encouraged to explore interests the way Kelsey was. I was expected to manage, a word my mother used so often, it eventually felt like a personality trait I'd been assigned without permission. Whenever something went wrong for Kelsey, it was treated like a household emergency. Whenever something went wrong for me, it was presented as a lesson. It didn't matter whether my sister actually deserved all that attention. She simply occupied the role so seamlessly that no one questioned it. I noticed the difference in 100 small ways, little things that didn't seem important one by one, but added up to something unmistakable when viewed together. If I brought home a good grade, it was met with a polite nod. If Kelsey brought home an average one, there was a congratulatory dinner. When I tried a new hobby, it was, let's see if it lasts. When she tried one, it was, what can we do to help you succeed? Even as kids, we understood the hierarchy. She was the one who got the final slice of cake, the front seat on road trips, the apology even when she started the argument. I became the quiet problem solver, the one who stopped asking for much because it was easier than being told my timing was inconvenient or my needs weren't significant enough. Silence felt less painful than disappointment. The strange thing is that I don't remember resenting her. Not at first. I remember watching her glide through childhood with a confidence that came from being constantly reinforced. and I remember wondering what it felt like to live without the sense that you had to justify your existence. I wasn't jealous of her advantages. I was jealous of her certainty. She walked through our house as if the walls themselves leaned toward her. I learned to move without making noise. Our aunt, Wendy Flores, was the only person who ever hinted that the dynamic was unusual. She once looked at me for an extra second too long, as if she was trying to translate a sentence she wasn't sure she should say out loud. She never interfered, never tried to overturn the system, but her eyes held the kind of understanding I didn't receive from anyone else. Sometimes that single look was enough to remind me that I wasn't imagining things. The older we became, the more natural the imbalance felt to everyone else. My parents didn't seem to think they were making choices. They acted like they were following gravity. And every time I adapted, every time I swallowed a need or redirected my hopes, the whole structure tightened into something more permanent. By the time adolescence ended, the roles were so established that reversing them would have felt like rewriting a family biography. Growing up that way didn't make me angry. It made me independent. But beneath that independence, something else quietly formed, an awareness that if I ever wanted anything meaningful, I'd have to build it myself. No one was coming to rescue me, praise me, or cushion my falls. I learned to carry my own weight long before I ever knew how heavy that weight would become. Adulthood arrived without ceremony, and the moment it did, the distance between me and the rest of my family widened in a way none of them seemed to notice. I moved out as soon as I could manage it, a small apartment with thin walls and cheaper carpet than I'd hoped for, but it felt like the first thing that belonged entirely to me. There was no audience there, no quiet expectation that I should step aside for someone else's comfort. For the first time, I could hear my own thoughts, without adjusting them to fit a household hierarchy. College wasn't a grand transition. It was a series of long shifts, late assignments, and quiet determination. I enrolled at a community college because it was the only option I could afford, then transferred to a state university when I'd saved enough to handle the tuition. Every dollar mattered. Every hour worked had a purpose. I kept a schedule taped above my desk with color-coded lines marking classes, job hours, and study blocks. Structure was the only thing that kept me from spiraling under the weight of constant responsibility. While my world revolved around stretching $20 groceries into a week's worth of meals, my sister's path unfolded like a curated brochure. My parents secured her an off-campus apartment with rent covered in full. They furnished it too, insisting she needed a comfortable environment to focus. When she switched majors 3 times, each time because a new interest sounded exciting, they reassured her that exploring options was normal. She had the freedom to drift, and no one questioned whether drifting had consequences. I understood she wasn't intentionally taking anything from me. The imbalance wasn't her creation, but she never rejected the benefits of it either. That part stung more than I wanted to admit. She accepted every safety net as if it were an expected part of adulthood rather than an advantage few people ever receive. Meanwhile, every decision I made required calculation. Every setback meant something else would have to be sacrificed. During those years, I held multiple part-time jobs: check-in clerk at a fitness center, cashier at a pharmacy, later a night shift receptionist at a logistics warehouse. The warehouse job paid slightly better, and that was enough motivation to stay even when exhaustion followed me like a shadow. Some nights I caught myself staring at the computer screen, wondering how other people found space in their lives for rest. But pushing through that period did something important. It taught me how to function without a safety cushion, how to move through challenges without expecting anyone to catch me. Independence wasn't a personality trait anymore. It was survival. My parents rarely asked how I managed. Their questions were polite but distant, the kind you ask a neighbor rather than a daughter. Whenever conversations happened, they centered around updates about Kelsey, her social life, her classes, her ambitions. She always seemed to be in the middle of a transition, and each transition required another round of support. I listened quietly, offering nods and acknowledging comments, because interrupting would only lead to reminders that your sister has a lot on her plate. I never argued. I'd learned long ago that arguing didn't change anything, it only labeled me as difficult. As time passed, the contrast between our trajectories grew sharper. I graduated with loans I'd have to chip away at for years. She graduated with none. I moved into a slightly larger apartment that still required budgeting down to the cent. She moved into a townhome my parents financed to help her get started. They called it a practical investment. I called it another chapter added to a pattern that had been cemented long before either of us reached adulthood. Despite everything, I didn't resent the distance forming between us. If anything, I welcomed it. Building a life on my own terms gave me clarity. Every setback taught me resilience, and every small win felt earned in a way nothing from childhood ever had. The further I moved from the gravitational pull of our family dynamics, the more I understood that independence wasn't loneliness, it was freedom. As the years shifted, a new clarity formed in the quiet parts of my routine. It didn't arrive through a sudden inspiration, but through long nights at the warehouse, watching shipments move in patterns the rest of the staff barely noticed. I became fixated on the inefficiencies, delays, misplaced items, outdated tracking systems that forced workers to rely on patchwork solutions. Something about the chaos felt fixable, and the idea followed me home each night until it settled into something larger than curiosity. I didn't have funding, connections, or family support, but I had discipline. That became the backbone of everything I built afterward. I started teaching myself basic coding after work, using free tutorials and a borrowed textbook. The learning curve was steep, but each concept pushed me forward. I treated every small milestone like proof that I could turn this interest into something tangible. Eventually, I created a simple prototype, a bare-bones system that could streamline internal routing. It wasn't impressive to anyone else, but to me, it was a doorway. I tested it relentlessly, adjusting functions, rewriting sections, documenting every bug. My apartment became a hybrid of workspace and storage unit, and the glow of my laptop stayed on long after the building fell silent. During that period, I made a deliberate decision. I wouldn't tell my family anything. Their pattern was predictable. If they knew what I was doing, they would ignore it until it benefited them. If it succeeded, they would treat it as a family asset. And if it failed, it would become evidence that I'd never been as capable as Kelsey. Silence felt safer. While my days were shaped around progress, theirs were still shaped around my sister. My parents kept praising her ambitions, even when those ambitions changed every few months. She drifted between job prospects without urgency because she knew the safety net beneath her would always hold. I watched from afar as she received temporary support that lasted years. My mother described her as finding herself, a phrase I learned to interpret as still waiting for someone else to solve things. Meanwhile, I registered my company, NR Logistics Software, LLC, and began pitching a functional version of my system to small businesses. Some rejected me, some didn't understand the value, but a few listened. A small distribution center became my first client, and the moment they agreed to implement the system, something inside me shifted. It wasn't pride. It was validation. The rare kind that comes from earning ground no one offered you before. The workload became overwhelming quickly. I balanced freelance contracts during the day with system development deep into the night. My bank account fluctuated in uncomfortable ways, but the progress felt worth every sacrifice. There were moments I questioned whether the effort would ever amount to anything, but giving up never entered the equation. Too much of my life had been spent proving I could handle things alone. Quitting would have meant accepting the narrative my parents had always painted for me. As the company expanded, I began reaching levels of responsibility I never imagined. I hired my first contractor, then a second. I secured a modest office space on the outskirts of town, just big enough for 2 desks and a whiteboard covered in deadlines. I learned negotiations, invoicing, investor meetings, skills no one had prepared me for. Each challenge became another layer of armor. Throughout all of it, I remained invisible to my family. They assumed my life moved in quiet, predictable lines. Each time I visited, the conversation revolved around Kelsey's next plan, next expense, next reinvention. The distance between us was no longer emotional. It was structural. They didn't ask questions about my work, and I didn't offer answers. It was easier that way. Silence prevented expectations, assumptions, and intrusions. Growth didn't feel triumphant. It felt steady, earned, and private. For the first time, my life was built entirely on choices I'd made, rather than the roles I'd been assigned. And even though no one else in my family recognized it, that difference mattered more than anything. As momentum gathered around the business, the pace of my life shifted into something I could barely recognize. The quiet structure I once relied on evolved into a relentless cycle of meetings, revisions, and decisions that carried weight I never anticipated. The company no longer felt like a side project. It had grown into a functioning machine fueled by expectation and potential. Each step forward demanded a new level of precision, and I adapted because adaptation had always been my default. Eventually, investors began approaching with interest that felt more serious than any pitch I had ever received. I met with each one cautiously, testing their intentions, evaluating whether their goals aligned with the integrity of the product. Success didn't feel like pride yet, but it felt tangible, something I could trace back to every night spent working through exhaustion. The acquisition talks began quietly. A mid-sized tech group requested a demo, then requested financials, then scheduled follow-up meetings that lasted hours. Every document I handed over represented years of discipline condensed into numbers and graphs. I kept my emotions controlled, not out of indifference, but because the possibility of something this large didn't feel real enough to celebrate. When the offer finally arrived, I reread the email several times to make sure I hadn't misunderstood it. They valued the company at $25 million and wanted to finalize within the quarter. The contract wasn't a surprise after the negotiations, but the number still felt surreal. I signed it alone in my office, surrounded by empty coffee cups and notes scribbled during late hours when I wasn't sure any of this would ever amount to more than an idea. There was no announcement, no triumphant call, no celebration. I saved a copy of the signed agreement, closed my laptop, and sat in silence as the weight of the moment settled into something complicated. I had never expected applause, but the absence of it felt sharper than I wanted to admit. Keeping it private wasn't a strategic choice. It was instinct. Everything in my upbringing had taught me that anything of value could be twisted into obligation if shared prematurely. So I said nothing. Not to my parents, not to my sister, not even to relatives who tended to treat information like currency. The success was mine, and for once, I wanted something in my life to remain untouched by the gravity of family dynamics. During that same period, my parents continued shaping their lives around whatever Kelsey needed. They refinanced part of their home to help her through what they called a transitional period. They covered bills she forgot to pay and praised her for working on stability, even when stability meant moving from one short-lived job to another. Their support was unwavering, and she accepted it without hesitation. I didn't resent the pattern. I had learned long ago that their choices had nothing to do with merit. They saw Kelsey through a lens that had been polished since childhood, and they saw me through a lens shaped by expectation rather than promise. Nothing I accomplished shifted their perspective, and I stopped wishing it would. As December approached, My Aunt Wendy Flores asked if I planned to attend the annual holiday dinner. She sounded genuinely curious, not probing. I told her I'd be there, and in her pause I could hear a hint of something. Maybe concern, maybe anticipation. She didn't know the details of the acquisition, but she knew I had been building something substantial. For reasons I couldn't explain, she was the only person whose reaction I didn't worry about. The night of the dinner, I drove to my parents' house with no intention of revealing anything. My goal was simple: show up, stay polite, avoid conflict, and leave early if things became uncomfortable. I didn't expect anything unusual to happen. I didn't expect questions I couldn't sidestep. And I definitely didn't expect the evening to shift in a direction that would unravel every remaining thread connecting me to that household. Walking up to the door, I felt none of the warmth typically associated with holidays, only a faint uncertainty about how the night might unfold. Stepping inside the house that evening felt strangely familiar, yet distant enough that I could sense how much I'd changed since the last time all of us shared a room. The decorations were already up, arranged with the same precision my mother always insisted on, and the usual noise of holiday chatter filled the background. Nothing about the environment hinted at the shift that would soon divide everything along a new fault line. I moved through the rooms with practiced caution, quietly acknowledging relatives and offering polite smiles, careful not to linger long enough for anyone to press for details about my life. Most interactions were surface level, and I preferred it that way. Avoiding attention had become second nature, especially in settings that revolved around old roles I no longer fit into. Dinner began with the predictable rhythm: plates being passed, questions directed toward familiar topics, and plenty of praise for whatever updates my sister shared about her current plans. I listened without comment, recognizing the dynamic as one I had learned to navigate long ago. The evening could have continued that way without disruption, if not for the one person who had always seen more than the rest. My Aunt Wendy Flores waited until the table settled before turning her attention toward me. She didn't raise her voice or make a show of it. She simply asked how my work had been going, phrasing the question with a tone that held more knowledge than curiosity. Her timing was deliberate, and in that brief silence after her words, I sensed the room shift. Eyes started turning in my direction, not with interest but with surprise that anyone had asked me something that required more than a quick answer. I felt the weight of the moment pressing against my chest, and for the first time that evening, there was no quiet route to escape. Holding back the truth felt heavier than letting it surface. I didn't offer details, only the core fact: that I had finalized the sale of my company. I stated the number without embellishment, keeping my voice steady, not because I wanted to impress anyone, but because I refused to disguise the work behind it. The table fell into a silence so complete it felt unnatural. Every expression around me shifted, not gradually but with abrupt certainty, as if each person needed a moment to confirm they'd heard correctly. Shock hit first, then disbelief, and then something far sharper. The atmosphere tightened in a way that didn't require words to interpret. My mother's posture changed, rigid and cold, carrying a tension I recognized from years of unspoken expectations. My father froze completely, his reaction so still it felt like a contained collapse. But the most jarring shift came from my sister. The expression she wore wasn't confusion or curiosity. It was a kind of panic that came from seeing a world she relied on tilt dangerously out of place. Her reaction built quickly. The quiet shock dissolved into visible agitation, her breathing unsteady as the number settled into something she couldn't rationalize. I could feel the energy around her collapsing, as if the stability she'd always assumed was now slipping through her fingers. The entitlement that had followed her since childhood didn't vanish, it surged. The realization that I had built something so substantial without their awareness scraped against the narrative she'd always lived inside. The tone of the room shifted further when judgment replaced silence. Expressions hardened, questions formed behind narrowed eyes. None of it needed to be spoken aloud for me to understand the accusations gathering around me. They weren't impressed. They weren't proud. They were incredulous that something significant had occurred without their permission, involvement, or benefit. What unsettled them wasn't the success itself. It was the independence behind it. The idea that I had built a future that didn't pass through their approval threatened the structure they'd upheld for years. My sister's distress deepened as she processed the implications, and the tension spreading across the table made it clear that every unspoken assumption in our family had been abruptly overturned. Their reactions were not about the number I'd said. They were about what that number meant in a household that had never expected me to matter. What followed did not explode all at once. It unfolded in quiet stages, the way a crack spreads through glass long before it finally shatters. Life went back to something that looked normal from the outside, but underneath, there was a constant sense that something was moving just out of sight, pulling at the edges of whatever was left between me and that house. The first sign came in the form of an alert from my bank. It was the kind of message I normally skimmed and deleted, but this one held numbers that did not belong to any plan I had made. Large transfers had been attempted from accounts linked to my name toward a destination I did not recognize. None of them had gone through, but they were close enough to feel like someone breathing on the back of my neck. When I called to verify the activity, the details they were allowed to share lined up with information only a narrow circle could have known. Security questions I had never given to anyone else had been answered. Contact information connected to my family address appeared in the log. No one at the bank said the word, but the implications sat there between the lines. Someone with access to my history had tried to turn that knowledge into opportunity. The realization did not arrive as a sharp burst of anger. It came as a slow, sinking heaviness, like discovering that the floor of a house you once trusted had been hollow for years. I had always understood that my family felt entitled to my time, my attention, and my emotional labor. Seeing evidence that they felt entitled to my money, down to the level of passwords and accounts, changed something fundamental in me. Self-preservation became less of an idea and more of a duty. I reached out to Alexis, the attorney I had been referred to months earlier, but never fully engaged. Sitting across from her in a quiet office, I laid out everything I knew: what the bank had flagged, the long history of financial favoritism toward my sister, the pattern of pressure that had intensified since my success became visible. She listened without flinching, then began outlining the steps needed to protect what I had built. Through Alexis, I brought Ryan into the picture to untangle the financial threads. He built a clear record of how much support had flowed toward Kelsey over the years, how often my parents had stepped in to absorb her mistakes, and how completely my own path had been separate from that safety net. Seeing the numbers lined up on paper made the imbalance impossible to frame as imagination or sensitivity. It was structure. It was proof. Logan handled the technical side, gathering logs and documentation from the bank with proper authorization. He traced connection points back to devices and locations that matched my parents' routines. Nothing about his work relied on emotion. It was timelines, access points, and consistent patterns. The more he uncovered, the harder it became for me to pretend any of this could be written off as confusion or a harmless misunderstanding. With those pieces in place, Alexis moved things out of the realm of family tension and into formal action. Letters went out. Restrictions were placed on who could contact my financial institutions. Claims were filed that forced my parents and my sister to respond in writing instead of behind my back. The tone of their messages shifted from moral pressure to defensive explanations the moment they realized there were consequences beyond my discomfort. The impact reached further than they expected. Their accounts drew scrutiny. Their attempts to move money raised questions they could not easily answer. Credit lines tightened. People they were used to impressing began to hear a version of events that did not match the story they had tried to tell about a selfish daughter withholding her share. Reputation, once treated as a shield, became another thing that could crack. Kelsey felt the shift sharply. Without easy access to new funding, she could no longer treat obligations as suggestions. The house payments that had once been cushioned became heavy. The car that had seemed like a symbol of status turned into a financial burden she could not carry. Selling things she once took for granted was not revenge from my side. It was a natural outcome of living without someone else's resources quietly filling the gaps. As all of this moved forward, I made quieter changes of my own. I moved to a different place, one that carried no shared history and no expectation that I would drop by out of habit. I tightened my circle to people who saw me as a person, not as a reservoir to draw from. I put more of my energy into work that mattered to me, mentoring others, supporting projects that aligned with the values I had carved out on my own. Cutting contact was not a single moment. It was a series of choices, ignoring calls, letting messages go unanswered, blocking channels that had once been open by default. There was grief in that, but it was the kind that comes from finally admitting a truth you have resisted for too long. I was not walking away from a loving support system. I was stepping out of a structure that had always required me to shrink so someone else could feel big. Looking back, what happened with the money is almost the least important part of the story. The real fracture came from realizing just how quickly people who claimed to love me could justify crossing every line when they believed they were owed something. The attempts to reach into my accounts were not just about greed, they were about control. The moment that control slipped, they chose violation over respect. If there is anything I want someone listening to this to take away, it is this. Sharing blood with someone does not mean you owe them access to your future. Support is earned through respect, not demanded through guilt. Boundaries are not betrayals. They are the only way to protect what you fought to build when no one else believed you would build anything at all. I did not cut ties because I stopped caring. I cut ties because caring had turned into a weapon in their hands, and I refused to let them use it to claim a life that was never theirs to own.